Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. This is Josh Wander from Jerusalem, Ir HaKodesh, the Holy City. I'm here with my co-host, Rabbi Moshe Lichtman from the city of Beit Shemesh.
Yes, hello. It's been quite a while. Our last show was 2 weeks ago on Yom Yerushalayim, and we had some technical difficulty. Hopefully that won't happen again today. And last Monday, of course, was Chag HaShavuot, and we didn't broadcast. So we're glad that you all came to join us today.
It definitely feels like it's been much longer than just 2 weeks with all that has happened, all that has occurred in the past couple of weeks. And we hope to discuss that. We hope to discuss some of the ramifications of that, some of the things that affect us in Israel, and some of the things that affect Jews that are abroad. Israel Unplugged, of course, is where you get the unadulterated facts of where we're holding in the redemptive process, focusing primarily on the ingathering of the exiles. This is a live show, and therefore we encourage all of our listeners to call in and give their comments and their suggestions and their questions. If you are unfortunate enough to be located in North America, then you should call in at 301-768-4841. I believe that number will even work if you're on a plane to Israel right now. You might be able to call in at that number, 301-768-4841. If you are one of the fortunate Jews that have made it back home, then you can also call in, and that number will be local at 02-650-0151, 02-650-0151. We want to encourage everyone to go to the websites of Rabbi Lichtman, which is toratzion.com, of course, toratzion.com, where you can find his books and his lectures and everything he's up to. We can also encourage you to go to the website bringthemhome.org.il, otherwise doing business as itstimetoleave.com. And at that website, you will find amazing videos, podcasts, and many other things that involve the Aliyah process, the process of the Jewish people coming home. Please stick with us because we're going to have a great show, and we'll be right back.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. So I just received an email from Rav Nachman Kahana. May he live and be well. It's an email which I thought was an appropriate way of starting the show now that I see it and reminded of it. I'm sure many of you have already heard it. But it was authored by his late brother, Hashem Yikom Damo, 40 years ago, and it is called Letter to the World. And he writes, Dear World, I understand that you are upset by us here in Israel. Indeed, it appears that you are quite upset, even angry. Indeed, every few years you seem to become upset by us. Today, it is the brutal repression of the Palestinians. Yesterday, it was Lebanon. Before that, it was the bombing of the nuclear reactor in Baghdad, and the Yom Kippur War and the Sinai Campaign. It appears that Jews who triumph and who therefore live upset you most extraordinarily. Of course, dear world, long before there was Israel, we, the Jewish people, upset you. We upset a German people who elected Hitler and upset the Austrian people who cheered his entry into Vienna. And we upset a whole slew of Slavic nations, Poles, Slavics, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Russians, Hungarians, and Romanians. And we go back a long, long way in the history of world upset. We upset the Cossacks of Chelyabinsk, who massacred tens of thousands of us in 1648 to 49. We upset the Crusaders, who on their way to liberate the Holy Land were upset at Jews that they slaughtered untold numbers of us. For centuries, we upset a Roman Catholic Church that did its best to define our relationship through inquisitions, and we upset the arch enemy of the Church, Martin Luther, who in his call to burn the synagogues and the Jews within them showed an admirable Christian ecumenical spirit. And it is because we became so upset over upsetting you, dear world, that we decided to leave you. In a matter of speaking, and establish a Jewish state. The reasoning was that living in close contact with you as resident strangers in the various countries that comprise you, we upset you, we irritate you, and we disturb you. What better notion than to leave you and thus love you, and have you love us, and so we decided to come home. Home to the same land we were driven out of 1900 years ago by a Roman world that apparently we also upset. And dear world, it appears that you are hard to please. Having left you in your pogroms and inquisitions and crusades and holocausts, having taken our leave of the general world to live alone in our own little state, we continue to upset you. You are upset that we repress the poor Palestinians. You are deeply angered over the fact that we do not give up the lands of 1967, which are clearly an obstacle to the peace in the Middle East. Moscow is upset and Washington is upset. The radical Arabs are upset and the gentle Egyptians, moderates, are also upset. Well, dear world, consider the reaction of a normal Jew from Israel. In 1920 and 1921 and 1929, there were no territories of 1967 to impede peace between Jews and Arabs. Indeed, there was no Jewish state to upset anyone. Nevertheless, the same oppressed and repressed Palestinians slaughtered tens of Jews in Jerusalem, Jaffa, Safed, and Hebron. Indeed, 67 Jews were slaughtered one day in Hebron in 1929. Dear world, why did the Arabs, the Palestinians, massacre 67 Jews in one day in 1929? Could it have been their anger over Israeli aggression in 1967? And why were 510 Jewish men, women, and children slaughtered in Arab riots between 1936 and 39? Was it because Arabs were upset over 1967? And when you, dear world, proposed a UN partition plan in 1947 that would have created a Palestinian state alongside a tiny Israel, and the Arabs cried no and went to war and killed 6,000 Jews, was that upset caused by the aggression of 1967? And by the way, dear world, why did we not hear your cry of upset then? The poor Palestinians who today kill Jews with explosives and firebombs and stones are part of the same people who, when they had all the territories they now demand be given to them for the state, as a state, attempted to drive the Jewish state into the sea. The same twisted faces, the same hate, the same cry of Itzbah al-Yehud, massacre the Jew, that we hear and see today, were seen and heard then. The same people, the same dream, destroy Israel. What they failed to do yesterday, they dream of today, but we should not repress them. Dear world, you stood by during the Holocaust and you stood by in 1948 as 7 states launched a war that the Arab League proudly compared to the Mongol massacres. You stood by in 1967 as Nasser wildly cheered by wild mobs in every Arab capital in the world vowed to drive the Jews into the sea. And you would stand by tomorrow if Israel were facing extinction. And since we know that the Arab Palestinians dream daily of that extinction, we will do everything possible to remain alive in our own land. If that bothers you, dear world, we think of how many times in the past you bothered us. In any event, dear world, if you are bothered by us, here is one Jew in Israel who could not care less. Rabbi Meir Kahana. I just had to read that. Many of us have already heard that, but it is, every time I see it, I'm amazed by how applicable it is today as it was when he wrote that 40 years ago. We live...
People just are so... they just can't accept the truth. It's unbelievable. Like, there's no argument that you could say against that. So what are they going to do? They're going to say... Rabbi Kahana was an extremist, and they won't deal with what he actually said, because what he actually said is 100% true and undeniable. That's unfortunately the way of the world. The same thing with today, with Hamas and everything else. Like, if you really think about it calmly, you think about the two sides and what's going on and who started it and who was the real aggressor, who was the real evil one. It's clear. As long as you have an open mind and you're really thinking about the truth, you really are seeking the truth. The problem is that there are people out there who don't care about truth. They just want to kill Jews. And that's why, anti-Semitism is the most irrational hatred, the longest and most irrational hatred in the world. It makes absolutely no sense. But it's a fact of life, unfortunately.
The past 2 weeks have been so packed with events. It's hard. It seems like it's been months or years. Even the day of Yom Yerushalayim, where I was one event after another, I felt like it was the most action-packed day of years that I've had here in Israel. I don't know where you were, Rav Moshe, during that day.
I was giving this show.
Part of it was on the show, right? Exactly, with technical difficulties.
Right.
But I am glad you didn't call me, because I was preoccupied that day. One thing after another. I'm just going to go through some of the things that happened to me that day on Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, on 2021. We started off having a blockade on our neighborhood. We weren't allowed in or out by the police because they felt it would be dangerous for us to drive cars outside of our neighborhood. Our community could not accept that as being acceptable, and about 150 to 200 men, women, and children decided that we are going to walk to the Western Wall, to the Kotel, as we do every Yom Yerushalayim. We are just going to leave the community and we're going to walk there. We live about, I would say, 10 minutes away, across the way on the Mount of Olives. And we started our walk towards the Old City. As we got around the bend, we were escorted by the border police. And as we got around the bend, from the top of the Temple Mount, it started raining down stones. If you could just imagine, the Temple Mount is very high up, many hundreds of feet up in the air. And they're throwing down stones on men, women, children, women with their little carriages, pushing their little babies, throwing these rocks down at them, obviously in order to injure and to kill anyone that they can. The border police, who were almost helpless at that point, started shooting what they were given to respond to riots, which in this case, what I call them, shooting Nerf balls. They were these guns that shoot like this foam, and it didn't even reach the Arabs that were throwing the stones. I don't know if they even realized they were being shot at with these devices, these anti-riot devices. And at some point, many people in the community were forced to draw their weapons and to shoot up in the air. When the bullets started flying over their heads, they realized very quickly that they should retreat. And that saved our lives. Of course, afterwards, our details were taken down by the police because we dared to defend our own lives, something that was very eye-opening. We did make it to the Western Wall, and we can usually at that time in the evening, late afternoon, evening, there are tens of thousands of Jews that are entering through the Damascus Gate coming to the Western Wall, coming to the Kotel Plaza to sing and dance and rejoice over this incredible miracle that happened to us 54 years ago when we liberated Jerusalem. But this year was different. There were just a few hundred people. They closed all of the gates, or I would say most of the gates, to the Old City, the Damascus Gate, the New Gate, the Lion's Gate, the Herod's Gate, the Shara Prachim, Jaffa Gate. The only gate that was open, at least at that point, was the Dung Gate. And there were people trickling into it, but very
Josh,
few.
I think we're going to have to go to a break, so we'll continue this right after the break. Just come right back.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yona. And yes, I can be all of those things. But at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Shalom, I'm Leah Aharoni. Join me on my show, News from the Torah. Each Sunday, we'll use the weekly Torah portion as a prism for understanding the news today. Listen to News from the Torah to gain clarity about the times we're living in and to understand your own spiritual path in the process. News from the Torah every Sunday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back. So I'm just going to continue with my story of Yom Yerushalayim, Tafshin Pei Aleph, an amazing Yom Yerushalayim. Make it quick, though, because we have a lot to speak about. So I get to the Kotel Plaza with a few hundred of our community, and we are there. We dancing, we're singing and rejoicing. And all of a sudden, a siren goes off, an air raid siren. It shocked a lot of people. A lot of people are not used to hearing here in Jerusalem air raid sirens, even in the worst of times. I remember during the times of the first Gulf War when Saddam Hussein was afraid to shoot his Scud missiles towards Jerusalem for fear of hitting a Muslim shrine or a Muslim community. And so this is a very unusual thing. There were many people that were affected by this. They immediately, in this way, it was fortunate that there weren't too many people in the Kotel Plaza at the time. They were able to move everybody into sheltered areas. If there were the normal crowds of tens of thousands, I don't know what they would have done. But considering just a few hundred that were there, it wasn't a problem. They sheltered them for a few minutes, and everybody came out and continued with their dancing and singing. I eventually made it back to my neighborhood, and when we got back to my neighborhood, I look out the window. I have a beautiful view of the Temple Mount outside of my window. We feel very privileged to live in such a special place in such a special time. And I see what it looks like the Al-Aqsa Mosque in flames, burning down. From my angle, at least from here in the east, the southeast, it seemed like that was what was happening. In reality, I found out subsequently that it was due to fireworks that were shot by the Arabs and caught one of the trees alight, and that created a big fire right next to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but it wasn't actually the Al-Aqsa Mosque that was on fire. But either way, it was very, very eventful. And that led into the entire war that we've seen over the past couple weeks. The rockets that have been going off almost nonstop in the south, in the north, the rioting, the civil war which has been going on inside the country, which is completely unprecedented. I was interviewed for the USA Today, and they were asking me what it felt like to live under this barrage of rockets, and I changed the narrative. I succeeded in changing the narrative of their article, that I said, the rockets are not such a big deal. Thank God, we have the Iron Dome, and the rockets caused relatively little damage. Compare that to what's going on inside the country with this civil unrest that is happening inside, with the Arab, what they call the cities of coexistence, the cities of Lod and in Ramla and in Jaffa and in Akko and Haifa, and you look at these cities that the Israeli Arabs, now this is, you have to understand, has been a taboo for the longest time here in Israel. One is not allowed to mention anything about Israeli Arabs because they, in our democracy, are equal citizens, so we cannot ever mention anything bad about them. The last person to try to do that was the person who authored the letter I just read, and he was very quickly run out of town. He was thrown out of the Knesset for doing so, and people have learned their lesson in the public sphere here since then, have not spoken about the Israeli Arabs and the fifth column that lives amongst us. That clearly has changed in the past week. People are starting to wake up very quickly to the fact that these peaceful Israeli Arabs are not as peaceful as they claim and can be very, very dangerous to the stability of the state. All this having been said, and there's a lot to be said, and including the fact that I'm not going to get into it in detail, but I was, what we say in Israel, I was lynched, which does not mean with a rope here. It means that I was ambushed by a group of Arabs last week, coming up the road in the city of David towards my home right before Shabbat. I noticed a huge garbage container in front of the road, which blocked my way, and then as I managed to swerve around that garbage container, an Arab noticed that I managed to get past their blockade, and he rammed me straight into my car to stop me. About 30 Arabs surrounded the car, stoning from all directions. Fortunately, I have, like I said, God on my side, and I also have an armored car. The stones did not manage to penetrate the vehicle. I did, with some evasive driving, manage to get myself out of that situation. And my car is totaled, but cars can be replaced. Thank God I am well, and I managed to say the blessing of Birkat HaGomel in the synagogue that week. So crazy things are going on. And people might mistakenly think that, number one, you may think that for us here in Israel, it's really difficult. It's really hard to live in Israel. There's a Yiddish expression that it is schwer zu sein a Yid. It's difficult to be a Jew, right? This is an expression that was used for millennia in the exile, in the ghettos, in the exile. It's so difficult to be a Jew. And people might think that Israelis are down on themselves and thinking it's so difficult to be a Jew living in Israel. But let me tell you, it is not difficult. We are very, very strong. Am Yisrael Chai. The Jewish people are alive and well, and we are not going to be so easily put down by a few rockets or some civil strife within the country, even an attempted lynching. And there are those that are outside of the country. There are Jews who are saying maybe this is not the time. Maybe this is not the right time, if there ever is a right time, to move to Israel to make Aliyah, because you know what? There is riots going on in the streets of America and in Europe, but there's also terrible things going on in Israel. What's the difference? I'm just reminded, yesterday I was at an Azkarat, at a memorial service for a friend named David Rosenthal that passed away last year, and I was told by his son that you're going to love this line. He used to tell his children that many people say that the streets of America are paved with gold. I'm sure you've heard that. The streets of America are paved with gold. He says, I want you to know, children, the streets of America are not paved with gold. They are paved with glue. And with that, he explained how Jews can get stuck so easily, like in a mousetrap in America, because the streets of America are indeed paved with glue. Jews in America are in a very, very difficult situation because they see that their society is quickly unraveling, and they mistakenly think that it is safer where they are than it is in Israel. Any comments?
Oh, for sure. There's this unbelievable story that is in one of my books. It's a biography on Rabbi Kook. And it talks about a meeting between Rabbi Kook and Rabbi Meir Yechiel Shapiro, who was known as the Rebbe of Drohobych. He was a Hasidic Rebbe who was a very big Zionist. And they met one day. Rabbi Kook came actually to visit the other Rebbe in his sukkah on the holiday of Sukkot. And the Rebbe, the Hasidic Rebbe, started by saying, my Hasidim ask me, my followers, in other words, they ask me why I urge them to emigrate from Poland to the land of Israel. After all, they argue There are troubles in the land as well. Arabs beat Jews, etc. In other words, of course, Poland wasn't so great in those days in the early 1900s. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, but it's not like there wasn't any anti-Semitism in Israel or Palestine at the time. So the Rebbe said to Rav Kook, I answered them that there's a big difference. In Poland, the Gentiles beat Jews because there are too many of them, while here in the land of Israel, they beat Jews because there are too few. Now, that is profound and that's true to this day, even though, thank God, we are almost 50% of the Jewish people living in the land of Israel. 6.8 million Jews live here. Amazing. But could you imagine if there are also 2 million Arabs living here? Could you imagine if we would be 10 million Jews living here, 12 million Jews living here? There would be nothing to talk about. There would be no way that the Arabs would have an uprising against us, because we'd be such a clear majority, and we would overtake them simply by, numbers wise. There would be too many of us for them to even dare to fight against. So that's what the Rebbe was saying, that in Poland they beat Jews because there are too many, but in Israel the only reason that they beat Jews is because they're too few. But that's not where the story ends. Rav Kook answered and said, I too was asked this question, and I explained the difference between Poland, in our case we could say the same thing about America, and the land of Israel as follows. There are two medical conditions that people face during their lifetimes. The first is physical degeneracy, which comes with old age. People get old. Everyone dreads this condition, even though in and of itself, it is not really dangerous. It's not dangerous to get old. People get old and they live long lives. The second condition, on the other hand, is actually dangerous. Nevertheless, everyone looks forward to it and is happy when it comes. That is, of course, childbirth. Childbirth can be dangerous. Thank God my daughter just had a baby, our first grandson.
Mazel tov.
And thank you. And it's not simple. We know that it's not simple to give birth. It's a very dangerous thing. You're allowed to be Mechalel Shabbat. You're allowed to break the Shabbos, the Sabbath, violate Sabbath in order to take a woman to give birth, because it is so dangerous. But nonetheless, everyone's thrilled when it happens. So what does that have to do with us? Says Rav Kook. The troubles that Jews face outside the land of Israel are the degenerative diseases of old age. It means that the exile is ending. It's time to go. It's time to leave. It's old age. It's almost the end. The troubles we face in Eretz Yisrael, however, are birth pangs. This is the beginning. We are just going through the birth pangs of the ultimate redemption. We know that the rabbis talk about what's called Chevlei Mashiach, the birth pangs of the coming of the Messiah. It's going to be a difficult time. It's not going to be an easy process. It's going to be accompanied by troubles. But we should be happy about it, because thank God we're at least giving birth. The birth is almost there. In fact, I believe the birth has already happened, and now we're in the growing stages. And hopefully, God willing, we will see the ultimate redemption very, very soon. So please, we have one more segment. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us, and we'll be right back very, very soon.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back. So we were discussing just now what the difference is living in the land of Israel as a Jew and living abroad, even in what we were going to call troubled times. And of course, Rabbi Lichtman properly explained that troubled times here are actually is a positive, not a negative. It's like the birth pangs of birth before a person's born. A woman has to go through a certain process of labor, and it's not pleasant, but it's something that's necessary and something that we all are very happy about in the end. And it's something similar that we're going through. We that live here and see what's happening are witnessing this happen every day. We witness the troubles. It's not that we're ignoring it. It's not that we're oblivious to it. We are very, very aware of what's going on around us on one hand. On the other hand, we understand that this is part of a greater process. And we are very fortunate to be active participants in that process. As much as a Jew can be Jewish in when they're outside the country and they can act like they're Jews, but they're not. They're bystanders when it comes to the nation of Israel and the redemptive process. To be a active participant in the process, one has to be here, and we encourage all Jews to come here. Of course, and we've said this a million times before. Of course, we do not encourage people to come here because they are running away from something. Today, it happens to be that it is not convenient. It is not pleasant to be a Jew wearing a kippah, putting a mezuzah on your door, openly looking Jewish in the streets of New York or L.A. or France or London or anywhere else that you might be in the world. It's not such a great time to be a Jew around the world. And you might think for that reason it's worth coming to Israel, just to run away from the anti-Semitism that is going on around the world. We encourage you to study and to understand the real reason for coming to the land of Israel. And the real reason is a very positive reason. And there's nothing negative about it at all. The reason you should come here is because God gave us the land and God wants the Jewish people to be in the land. And that's the reason people should come back. If it happens to be that you come back during times of I'm not saying you shouldn't come because of anti-Semitism, but that shouldn't be what drives you to come here. What drives you to come here should be your love for the land, and it's that which will keep you and protect you while you're here.
Right, that's a last resort. The anti-Semitism is supposed to be a last resort. God gives us so many signs calling us back to come to the land of Israel. He has given us the land. We are once again sovereign in our homeland. He has made the land flourish. He has given such economic prosperity to the Jews in Israel, to the land of Israel. These are all ways that God is calling us back. By the way, also from a Torah perspective. I mean, the land of Israel is the center of Torah learning in the world today, something that hasn't been in 2,000 years. So for all these reasons, a Jew should come, and that's God calling us and saying, time to come home. But when a Jew doesn't listen to all of those calls, eventually God still wants us to come back. So for those who are a little bit hard of hearing, he has to scream a little bit. He has to, raise his voice and say, hey, hello, time to come home. And he will sort of force the Jews out of exile. And let's hope he doesn't have to do that. Let's hope the Jews will wake up before it's too late and come back to Israel for the positive reasons, like you said.
It is definitely a tug of war. It's like on one hand, Hashem wants us to come because we are choosing to come here, as many of us have, especially those that have made Aliyah from North America and from prosperous nations around the world. But that having been said, you cannot deny the fact that a lot of, maybe even the majority of Jews that immigrated to the land came here because they were running away from something. They were running away from things in 1948. They were running away from things ever since. All the different countries that we have abandoned, often it's not because we have it so good there. And that may be the hardest part. I always say that the worst exile is the one that you don't realize you're in. And when you're in a country that is so prosperous, when you're in a country that is you're so comfortable, at least there are some people that are still around that are willing to admit the truth, and they're willing to say, why am I living in America? Why am I living in Canada? Why am I living in Europe today? Because it's comfortable. Because as a Jew, I'm doing, my business is doing well, my family's doing well. It's a comfortable life. And if you're willing to admit that, at least you're on the first step. It's like being in a Alcoholics Anonymous program, right? The first step is admitting that you have a problem. And the first step in getting out of exile is realizing that you're in exile. There's a problem here, right? I'm here because even though I'm not supposed to be here, I'm just too comfortable. It's too easy for me to be here. And in that vein, Hashem sometimes has to shake things up in order so Jews will not feel as comfortable as they always do, that they'll realize, hopefully it won't get to the point where there's going to be violence and casualties as a result. It could stop at the point where people are just, when you have an earthquake and it starts with some, small tremors, that gives way to the big earthquake. When people are starting to feel the tremors that are happening around the world today, Jews should start to think, this is a sign that we are supposed to wake up. We're supposed to realize that this is not where the Jews are supposed to be. I remember when, I think I may have mentioned this before on the show, I was on a speaking tour in New York, on the city street of Manhattan, where they were having a rally, and a rabbi got up to speak, and he was a prominent rabbi. I'm sure everybody knows his name. Doesn't matter. He gets up to speak, and he starts to speak about, in this case, it was about my friend Ari Fuld, Hashem Yikam Damo, that was murdered. And as he's speaking, in the middle of his speech, a truck drives by, slows down next to the rally, and screams. The truck driver screams out the window as loud as he can. He says, "Jews, go home." Now, I was live streaming this event, and I didn't even realize it until I watched it afterwards. But I guess subconsciously, here it was vocally, I said to myself, why is this anti-Semite in the truck, this truck driver, saying Jews come home, and the rabbi is up there speaking? He's not saying Jews go home. It seems like it's backwards over here. We're hearing the voice from the wrong end. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes the anti-Semitic truck driver to drive the message home, because the rabbis are perhaps not getting the message across as well as they should be.
Wow. That is a very powerful story. I think I'm going to use that from now on. Unfortunately, as Rav Kook says, that sometimes we need our enemies to blow the shofar of Mashiach into our ears. I'm not going to go through the whole piece, but it's a very beautiful piece called Shofarot, where he spoke about 3 different types of shofarot. There's the nice one, the purely kosher one, and the one that's kacha kacha. So and then there's one that's totally not kosher, but still sometimes it can be used. And he relates that to the shofar of Mashiach, because we know there's this concept, there's going to be a shofaro shel Mashiach, the shofar, the ram's horn, right, of the Messiah. And he says, well, it doesn't mean literally a ram's horn that he's going to necessarily, blow a shofar. It means that there's processes that go on and that call the Jew. What does the shofar do? It calls people, in the olden days before they had, WhatsApp. It would call people to come together. You'd hear a shofar blowing and say, "Oh, it means they're calling us. We have to go. We have to gather together and hear the message." Right. So sometimes the message, the shofar blowing, is done by a very holy and pious person. Sometimes it's done by somebody who's maybe not so. And then it comes to the sometimes it's an anti-Semite who does it, who's telling you, get out of here. We don't want you here, which is the most ironic thing, by the way. I mean, these pro-Palestinian thugs who go around beating people up in New York City, like, what are they saying? They are saying that the Jews in Israel are oppressing the Palestinians and taking away their lands. And what are they doing? They are beating up and causing Jews in America to think 2 and 3 times whether they should really be staying in outside the land of Israel. And maybe some of those Jews are going to pick up and move to Israel. They're shooting themselves in the foot. They don't even realize it, because they're not acting on their own. As I said before, anti-Semitism is so irrational. They're acting. They are pawns in the hands of God. God is using them. I mean, they are certainly not righteous people. They are certainly people who do hate the Jews, and they are tremendous, wicked people. But, God is putting this idea or making it stronger in their minds so that they can tell the Jewish people, get out of here. It's time to go home. What are you doing here? Why are you staying so long? Don't you know that I've already given you back the land of Israel? It's time to come home. Time to build up the land and make it a holy place and make it world peace. I mean, everyone talks about peace. We want world peace. That's what our Messiah will bring, world peace. Peace to the entire world, not just to the Jewish people. That's what we're looking forward to.
The Chassam Sofer, a great rabbi from 2 centuries ago, he says that we're not allowed to pray that the wars should stop. He's speaking about wars that were going on in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and he saw we know from the Talmud, we learned that the Messiah, the redemptive process is going to come about by war. And we can't stop that. We can't slow that. We can pray that people should not be harmed. We don't want people to be hurt. But the wars have to continue because that is what is going to bring about the redemptive process. And he understood this to be something that was happening in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which is hard to understand, but things definitely that are happening in Israel today, around Israel today. In Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount, there is no question that this is directly involved in the redemptive process, and it's bringing us closer every day. We invite you to come and join us.
Okay. See you next week. Thank you for joining us.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.